Okay, so I moved in with a good friend recently, and it's been all chill. My brother recently passed, so having Dakota here to comfort me is nice. Everything is great. We're both gamers, so we usually do that when we're not working. In the house is Dakota, his dog, and me. The house has a basement and a room upstairs. It's a pretty cool house. The backyard is big enough for our pit bull Bubbles to run around and have a good time doing so. I've learned that every house has its bad spot, and this house has its shed. I don't know what it is about that thing, but it gives me the creeps. I tend to avoid it as much as possible. 3 weeks into living here, and I begin to notice strange knocking on the walls. Okay, old house. Maybe the dog is whacking shit with her tail. Anyways, I tried to ignore it for the most part, but you know. So, a few weeks more go by, and Dakota and I are playing the games in my room. He gets up and says he's going to the restroom, so I pause the game and he leaves to do so. The bathroom is to the right of my room, which is in the basement to the left. It's the stairs going up. So Dakota is in the restroom and I'm waiting for him. When I see him step into the doorway from the left. This confused me because, as I said earlier, the bathroom is to the right. Instead of coming back into the room, Dakota glares at me and begins walking back towards the stairs after saying,
I need your help with something.
I get up and begin to follow him. Just as I see him walk up the stairs and out of view, the bathroom door opens behind me and Dakota asks me,
Who the fuck just walked up the stairs?
I panicked and jumped back down into the basement. I fill Dakota in on what happened and we search the house and find nothing. Dakota then calls me into the kitchen and shows me that the back door was open. Weird. Days go by, and at this point I feel unsafe in my house. I'm trying to get over it, but I constantly feel like somebody is behind me. Yesterday was probably the strangest encounter. I was in the kitchen loading the dishwasher when Bubbles runs in with her fur all pointed. I know that means the dog is on edge, so I ask her what's wrong. She goes to the back door and looks at me. She looked pissed. I open the door and I watch as she runs towards the shed. I decide to follow her because of her enraged behavior and damn near pissed myself when I see her behind me walking in from the living room. I quickly close the back door and look out the window. Right next to the shed where I last saw Bubbles is Dakota. He looked extremely angry. His face terrified me. So I yell for Dakota and he runs into the kitchen. I point out to the shed only to see that Dakota is gone. I don't know what this is, but I have the suspicious feeling that they're trying to lead me to the shed. I have begun to question everyone and I can't help but feel paranoid. Any advice would help greatly. Thank you. I've always had an interest in the supernatural. I tried calling out a Bloody Mary and attempted to contact ghosts through white witness. Of course, none of these worked the way I thought they would. I wanted to have a real supernatural experience, so I started to dig a little deeper on the internet. I came across a blog from a man living in Japan who was warning others not to play a game called Hitori Karenbo or something like that. In the blog, he claimed his friend informed him that he was going to play the game and report back to him the next day to detail his experience. He never contacted it back. The man wrote that after days of no contact, he went to his friend's house to see what was going on, and when he entered the house, the friend was nowhere to be found. He believes he was taken by something. This piqued my interest, so I looked further into the game and discovered the instructions on how to play. They were pretty simple to follow. The requirements were a stuffed doll, sharp object, a sewing needle, uncooked rice, incense, red thread, fingernail, and a bathroom with a tub. I had most of these things except for incense and the doll. I thought it would be fun to raise the stakes a little bit, so I went online and searched for cursed dolls. I found that the seller claimed the soul of an ancient demon was trapped in it after an exorcism in Morocco, and that he was selling it in fear of it ever escaping. Sounded perfect to me. Yesterday, the doll arrived in the mail. It smelled terrible, and I could almost sense the evil inside of it. It was time to play. I loaded up the instructions. I bookmarked on my browser and followed them. Step 1. Cut the doll open with a sharp object and replace the stuffing with the uncooked rice. Place your fingernail inside of the doll as well. Sew the doll shut with the sewing needle and the red thread. Do not snip the red thread. Instead, tie the remaining thread around the doll. Fill the tub with water. Step 5. Choose your hiding place and purify the room with incense. I skipped this step since I forgot the incense. Step 6. Name the doll. I named it Charlie, as I didn't know whether it was a boy or a girl. That's the first unisex name that came to mind. Step 7. Wait until 3 a.m. and repeat the phrase 3 times. I am it. First, place the doll into the tub immediately following this. Turn out all the lights in the house, go to your hiding place, and close your eyes. Count to 10. In my case, my hiding place was a secret small door in my closet, hidden by being painted the same color as my wall. It's only big enough to fit me crouched. Step 9. Once finished counting, return to the bathroom and remove the doll from the water. I said the phrase instructed, I have found you, Charlie. And step 10, finally, remove the red thread from the doll and before placing it back into the water, say, Charlie, you are now it. I snuck back into my secret small door and remained silent. I had my phone with me, but I had it on silent with no vibrate. I sat for almost 2 hours and didn't hear anything, so I believe that this game was another failure just like the previous. I left my hiding place and returned to the bathroom to retrieve the doll, but when I got there, the tub was empty. Suddenly, from the floor below, I heard running. I immediately jetted back to my hiding place. The footsteps entered my room. Someone was outside of the door. All I heard was what I can only describe as whispering screaming. I was terrified. The footsteps ran back down the hall and down the stairs, and I remained hidden. I could hear it opening and shutting closets and drawers from the floor below. It would run back upstairs into my room, still making the horrible noise, then repeat running back downstairs. It's been 24 hours and I'm still in my hiding spot. I hear it run up and down my stairs repeatedly since last night, still searching for me. I have no idea what to do, but I can't survive in this spot forever. I'm too terrified to leave as I don't know what waits for me. If anyone has any advice, please let me know. I hope I can read it before my phone battery dies. In advance, here's an advice for all of you. Don't play this game. My father always made sure me and my brothers were close growing up. Despite being a couple years apart, we all did the same sports, played the same games, went to the same school, and had each other's backs. Even as young as I was, I always appreciated my father's diligence in building that bond between us. I didn't realize there was a clear motivation behind it until the day he sat me down and talked about his own story growing up with his only brother. He wanted to wait until I was old enough, and after everything I learned, I appreciated him more for it. Your Uncle Hiro was a troubled soul, Dad led off with. He was smaller than the average kid, and everyone let him know it. There was no holding back when we were growing up. You took shit or you let it get to you and brought more on yourself. Hiro always acted like he could take it, but I suppose I just ignored the signs myself. When we were teenagers, Hiro fell in with what I guess you'd call the wrong crowd. Those kids that dressed in all black and listened to the music that make your grandmother have a migraine for weeks. We were polar opposites, really, and I had no desire to understand what he did with his time. He didn't talk much, he mostly just existed in the same house and thought nothing of it. Things changed when summer started in 1986. We were fresh out of junior year and had the best year of our lives to look forward to. While I spent my days at the beach, Hiro was with a little crew doing God knows what in the woods north of town. One evening, I was getting ready to go out when I saw him dipping out ahead of me. He seemed like he was in a hurry to go and had his hands full with a really big book and some cheap candles that looked like they came from our mother's room. Thinking nothing of it, I locked the door behind us, got in my car, and took off. Son, I don't remember what I did that night. The hours before Hiro came home are lost to time, or maybe just too insignificant to recall. Hiro came to my room and shook me awake. He told me he did something really stupid and he didn't know what he was going to do. I remember wanting to shove him out and make him wait till morning, but the tremor in his voice had me concerned enough to hear what he had to say. Hiro went into the deepest part of the woods that night, with his creepy crowd in tow. They planned on smoking and listening to heavy shit while cursing their family and the shitty life they were stuck in. He brought this big black book and candles out there with the intention of changing his life. He said he was gonna summon something, maybe the devil, maybe a guardian angel, who knows. But his friends had talked up all that witchcraft stuff enough to make him think it could change his world forever. So he drew some circles in the dirt, lit the candles, and read the book, while his friends looked on and encouraged him. His girlfriend laid with him in the circles and they writhed around for a while in ecstasy while the onlookers cackled and chanted. When the candles started to dwindle, Hiro said he felt heavy, tired. He was ready to go home. His girlfriend was still excited, wanted to keep going at it. He didn't want to, but she wasn't having it. She got on top of him and kept on with it. Hiro laid back and obliged while she used him. He described in detail what he was doing, and to this day it haunts me. His arms were behind his head, letting her do all the work. His eyes were closed, trying to get into the feeling of it all. And then he snapped out of everything when she let out a loud yelp. This wasn't a cry of pleasure, it was pain. Maybe of fear. She shot away from him, and when he tried to approach her to ask what was wrong, she brandished at him and told him to stay away from her. The others pulled away from their party to see what was going on. She was trying to clutch at her back, and she was crying. Her friends ran to her and stood her up, trying to wrap a jacket around her. Just before it draped around her back, Hiro saw what had caused her to retreat. 2 long gashes were reamed across her back, and she was bleeding like crazy. She described the jagged look of her flesh around the marks, like something only a great big beast could have done. They threw things at him, screamed at him, and wouldn't hear a word he had to say. They turned their backs on him and left him in a confused mess in those woods. Hyro recounted everything that happened in so much detail it took me what seemed like an eternity to process it all. He had come home and spilled it all to me, the brother that was barely even there for him. I still didn't believe him even that night, after he confessed to all of that horror, and I regret that to this day. He didn't sleep much after that night. He always said he couldn't. When I wouldn't see him around the house occasionally, his neck looked red and blotchy like he had been rubbing at it for hours. His nails were practically gone, like he had pulled them off his fucking fingertips himself. His eyes seemed blank, and the dark circles under them were hardly unnoticed. He left the lights on everywhere he went, like he didn't want an inch of the house to be dark. When Mom went into his room late one night and his lights was still on, she found him passed out in the heap of his bed. She flicked off the light and closed his door. I'll never forget the scream, the blood-curdling scream that came from that room. Dad rushed in to find him grabbing at his neck, and he was just yelling over and over, yelling, "Who turned it off? Who fucking turned it off? You can't turn it off. Who turned it off?" Hyro left the next morning. I peeked out my window as the sun was breaking the horizon, just a backpack slung over his shoulder as he lumbered into the street. I could still see it when I closed my eyes sometimes. As he walked away, I could see his shadow stretch across the lawn, with an identical shadow splitting off in the opposite direction. Dad said he hasn't seen his brother Hyro since that day. Dad went on with his life. He met my mom a few years later and started our family. Hyro never reached out. I've never met him and rarely heard about him until today. Someday, Dad will tell me my younger brothers too, why they're older. I guess I'm sharing because I'm still trying to process it all. I don't hate Dad for sharing the story. I know he felt he had to, and when I do finally come to terms with it, I can talk to Mom about it, about the scars and her other shadow. The story takes place in 2005, if I'm not mistaken. At the time, I was still in college, but my hometown was a short drive away, so I ended up working at my local library. This part is relevant because I believe the subject of this story attained my info through this means. I've had numerous creepy encounters with people, mostly men, throughout my life. I'm a straight male, but my short stature and boyish looks tend to attract a certain subset of creeps. Though not as much as a woman has to suffer, I can at least say I understand the psychological terror it can instill. But the library seemed to be like an epicenter of creeps. Like this creepy dude who wanted to paint me in private, which is in itself another story for another day. So, one morning during the summer of that year, after a pretty heavy night of drinking with some friends, I get a phone call from an unknown number. It's the 2 zeros, so I wasn't one to ignore calls at that time. And it was coming in at a ridiculously early time, so I worried it was something serious. Well, on the other end was this guy who sounded like he lacked confidence. You could hear the quivering in his voice. He asked if he could speak to, let's say, Charles. It was concerning some kind of business proposal. I told him he had the wrong number, but he kept insisting that it was okay, and he'd talk to me instead. Since this happened so long ago, and I was certainly hungover. I can't remember the details of what came next, except that it was very persistent, somewhat nonsensical and very annoying, so I hung up on him after a little bit. A week or two would go by without incident, but one early morning, and another hangover one at that, another call from a different unknown number, same MO, asking for someone I didn't know about another deal or home being sold. Whatever he could come up with. Again, I told him he had the wrong number, and this time promptly hung up after he went through his spiel that it was okay and he could talk to me instead. This started happening more frequently, seemingly at random since he wasn't consistent with what day he'd call, but it was always super early. I still don't know why I continued to pick up the unknown numbers, but even with the unsettling nature of the calls, I wasn't 100% creeped out. Until one morning when I got another call. Same setup, except after I once again told him he had the wrong number and that I didn't want to hear another proposal or whatever. He said in a really creepy whisper that he wanted to see my nether regions. I told him if he didn't stop, I was going to call the cops. I heard him stutter, then he hung up himself. Never heard from him again. Now, the reason why I think the library is relevant here is because the place was mostly run by elderly women. They were as sweet as can be, and I loved working for them. But they had a penchant of trusting random weirdos with personal information about their staff. The creep who wanted to paint me, for example, learned of my full name and what I was studying in school simply by asking one of them when they were stationed at a desk. I know that doesn't seem totally weird, but I felt it was a breach of my privacy, especially after that same creep, knowing I was immediately uncomfortable in his presence, began to come in and linger around me when I would be stationed at the checkout counter, including leaning in real close and breathing heavily on me, gross stuff like that. So I wouldn't be surprised if the phone creep got my info the same way, if he and the painter weren't one and the same. So, creepy morning phone call guy, let's not meet.